His name was Edwin Poole, and he stood on the corner of Maple and 114th, holding a hand-painted sign that read, "They are already dead. You will be next." I passed him every morning on my way to the bus stop. For 3 weeks straight, rain or shine, Edwin stood there in the same brown corduroy jacket with electrical tape patching the elbows, his voice hoarse but steady, shouting at anyone who would listen. Nobody did? I certainly didn't. My name is Marcus Adler, and I was 34 years old when the world ended on a Tuesday. Not with a mushroom cloud or an asteroid or some dramatic biblical flood. It ended with a smell, sweet and chemical, like overripe fruit left inside a hot car, drifting through the open kitchen window while I poured my daughter her cereal. Let me back up. Our street, Maple Avenue, in the northeastern sprawl of a city called Hargrove, was the kind of block where people waved but didn't visit. 22 homes, mature oak trees, driveways with basketball hoops bolted above the garage. It was unremarkable in the way that felt deliberately engineered. You moved to Maple Avenue because you didn't want surprises. My wife, Donna, had chosen it for exactly that reason 4 years earlier, when she was pregnant with our daughter, Lily. "This is the kind of street where nothing happens," Dana had said on the day we signed the mortgage papers. She'd meant it as praise. Edwin Poole disrupted that myth. He wasn't from our block. I think he came from the apartments east of the highway overpass, though no one confirmed it. He simply appeared one morning in late September, planted himself beneath the stop sign, and began warning us about something he called the spread. People dismissed him instantly. Gerald Huang, who lived 2 houses from us, called the non-emergency police line during Edwin's first week. "There's a mentally ill man frightening the children," Gerald had reported. A patrol car rolled by once, and the officer inside didn't even get out. Edwin stayed. I remember the specific morning everything shifted. October 14th. Lily was 5 and had recently learned to read cereal boxes. She was sounding out the word riboflavin at the kitchen table when I noticed movement through the window above the sink. Across the street, the Delacroix house, home to a retired couple, Fran and Bertram, had its front door wide open. This was unusual because Bertram Delacroix was obsessively private. He mowed in long sleeves. He closed his blinds by 6 every evening. The door stayed open for 4 hours. No one entered or exited. "Maybe they're airing the house out," Dana said from behind her laptop. She was editing curriculum plans for her 4th grade class. "Since when does Bertram air anything out?" She shrugged. I let it go. That afternoon I saw Edwin again on my walk to grab the mail. He was sitting on the curb this time, sign propped against the stop sign pole, eating an apple. He looked at me with eyes that were exhausted but startlingly focused. "You live here?" he asked. "Down the block." "You noticed the Delacroix place?" I stopped walking. "How do you know their name?" "I've been watching the street longer than you think." He took another bite. "Bertram hasn't come outside in 6 days. Before that, he was stumbling, walking wrong. Fran's been calling someone every night from the porch. I can hear her crying from here." "That's not," I started. "I'm not crazy, friend." He stood, his knees cracked. "Something's moving through the east corridor. Started at Greystone Towers, jumped to the Ridgeland houses. Now it's here. You can smell it at night. Sweet, like something fermenting." The chemical fruit smell. I'd noticed it for 3 days and blamed the storm drains. "I'm not asking you to believe me," Edwin said. "I'm asking you to pay attention." I walked away. I didn't pay attention. Not that night, when the smell thickened. Not the next morning, when Fran Delacroix's car was gone and never came back. Not even when Gerald Huang knocked on my door on October 16th, visibly shaken, and told me that Bertram had been taken away in an ambulance at 3 in the morning, thrashing against the paramedics with a sound Gerald described as not human. I didn't listen until it was far too late. That's the confession. That's where this starts. The Hargrove local news ran a 14-second segment about a respiratory illness cluster in the eastern neighborhoods. 14 seconds. I know because I rewound it and counted. The anchor transitioned seamlessly into a story about a golden retriever who could skateboard. Dana and I watched it from the couch after putting Lily to bed. Neither of us said anything, but something in my peripheral awareness had shifted. I started cataloging details the way you do when you sense a storm forming, but can't yet see the clouds. The Delacroix house stayed empty. 2 more homes on our block went quiet. The Nassers at the far end, and a young couple, Jake and Priya Maddox, who had moved in only 3 months prior. Jake's truck sat in the driveway for 5 consecutive days without moving. Priya's herb garden, which she tended with religious consistency, began to wilt. I mentioned this to Dana. She told me I was spiraling. "You're doing that thing," she said, "where one weird detail becomes a conspiracy." 3 houses on our block have gone dark in 2 weeks. People travel. People get sick. People have lives we don't see. She wasn't wrong, technically, but she wasn't right either. On October 19th, I did something out of character. I walked down to Edwin Poole's corner after dinner. He was still there, though his sign had changed. It now read, "Stage 2 is contagious. Stay inside after dark." He saw me coming and didn't gloat. "Tell me everything," I said. Edwin had been a respiratory therapist at Greystone Memorial Hospital until 6 weeks prior. He'd treated the earliest patients, people brought in from a low-income housing complex east of the highway. The symptoms were unlike anything in the diagnostic manuals. Phase 1. Presented as extreme fatigue, disorientation, and a sweet-smelling perspiration that stained clothing yellow. Phase 2 brought motor degradation, loss of speech, and aggression. Phase 3. Edwin paused here and looked at the ground. Phase 3, they stop being people. What does that mean? It means what you think it means, cognitive death. But the body keeps going. It responds to sound, to movement. It attacks anything living that gets close. I wanted to laugh. I physically felt the laugh building in my chest, because the alternative, taking this seriously, was so destabilizing that my body rejected it. But I didn't laugh, because Edwin's face held no performance. There was no mania in his delivery. He spoke the way a surgeon delivers a prognosis, with the grim precision of someone who has already processed the horror and arrived at function. "Why aren't you going to the media, the CDC?" I did. I went to the regional health office, the Hargrove Gazette, Channel 4, Channel 9, the mayor's public health liaison. He listed them like items on a grocery receipt. They said the situation was under review. One reporter told me off the record that they'd been told not to pursue it, that it was being handled federally. Federally. His word. I stood there on the corner of Maple and 114th with the streetlight buzzing overhead and the faint smell of that sweet chemical rot drifting from somewhere east, and I felt the first real fracture in the architecture of my normal life. "What do I do?" I asked. "You prepare. Quietly. Don't draw attention. Stock water, food, first aid. Board your basement windows if you have them. Get to know which neighbors you trust. Actually trust, not barbecue invitation trust. And keep your daughter inside after sundown." The mention of Lily hit me somewhere behind the sternum. "How do you know I have a daughter?" "I've watched her walk to the bus stop with you for 3 weeks, Marcus. I know more about this street than anyone on it." That night, I lay in bed next to Dana, staring at the ceiling, listening to the neighborhood. A dog barked. A car alarm chirped and silenced. Somewhere distant, a sound I hadn't heard before. A low, guttural moan that could have been wind through drainage pipes. Could have been. I didn't sleep. I don't think the version of me who slept peacefully exists anymore. The next morning, I drove to 3 different stores. I told Dana I was picking up oil for the truck and batteries for the smoke detectors. Both things we actually needed, which made the lie easy. At the hardware store, I bought 16-gauge plywood sheets, a box of 3-inch screws, duct tape, and a battery-powered lantern. At the grocery outlet, I filled 2 carts with canned goods, powdered milk, rice, dried lentils, bleach, and a 20-gallon water jug. At the pharmacy, I bought a full first aid kit, extra children's ibuprofen, antiseptic, and 4 bottles of rubbing alcohol. The cashier at the grocery outlet looked at my haul and asked if I was preparing for a hurricane. Something like that, I said. At home, I carried everything to the basement in stages while Lily was at school and Dana was at work. Our basement was unfinished. Concrete floor, cinder block walls, 1 narrow window at ground level facing the backyard. I arranged the supplies along the east wall and covered them with an old tarp. Then I stood in the center of that cold room and tried to reconcile 2 versions of myself. The rational man who had a mortgage and a retirement account and parent-teacher conferences, and the man who had just spent $400 preparing for societal collapse based on the testimony of a stranger on a street corner. The rational man almost won. Almost. What stopped him was a text from Gerald Huang at 2:47 that afternoon. Did you hear about the Maddox house? Jake attacked the mail carrier this morning, bit him on the arm. Police came. Jake didn't respond to commands. They tased him twice. He didn't go down. I called Gerald immediately. He picked up on the first ring, breathing fast. I watched from my window, Gerald said. Marcus, Jake didn't look right. His skin was gray, not pale, gray, and his eyes were open, but they weren't tracking, like he was looking at something behind everything. Where's Priya? Nobody's seen her in a week. Where did they take Jake? I don't know. The officers put him in the back of the cruiser, but he was slamming himself against the partition so hard the car was rocking. They called for backup. A van came. Unmarked. Black. 2 people in full hazmat suits got out. They transferred Jake into the van. The whole thing took 8 minutes, and then they were gone. I sat down on my porch steps. The sweet smell was stronger now. Not faint, not suggestive. Present. Like someone had spilled fermented juice across the entire block. Gerald, I need you to listen to me. I know this is going to sound extreme. I already started packing supplies, he interrupted. My wife thinks I've lost my mind. But I saw that man's face, Marcus. That wasn't Jake anymore. Something about Gerald's confirmation. This measured, analytical engineer who alphabetized his spice rack. Believing what I believed made the crisis suddenly tangible. It was no longer Edwin's warning or my paranoia. It was a shared recognition, and shared recognition has gravity. I told Gerald about Edwin. I told him everything. The phases, the hospital, the federal stonewalling. Gerald listened without interrupting, which was unlike him. We need to talk to the block, he said. Not yet. We don't know who'll panic and who'll help. Then who? I thought about our neighbors, not as faces over fences, but as potential allies or liabilities in a scenario I could barely articulate. Ruth Castellano, 3 doors down, was a retired Army nurse. She was sharp and unflappable. Tom Beckford across the street was a general contractor with a workshop full of tools. Amara Singh, next door to the Delacroix house, Worked nights as an EMT and had the steadiest hands of anyone I'd ever seen. Ruth, Tom, and Amara, I said. Tonight, after dark. My garage. After dark? Edwin said they're more active at night. If anything's moving out there, I want us inside with the doors locked. The silence on Gerald's end lasted 3 full seconds. I'll be there at 8, he said. And then quieter. Bring the plywood. They came separately, within minutes of each other. The way people arrive at a funeral. Reluctant, purposeful, already grieving something they can't yet name. Gerald first, carrying a canvas bag clinking with canned goods he hadn't been asked to bring. Then Ruth Castellano, in her olive field jacket, reading glasses pushed up into silver-streaked hair, her posture suggesting she'd already assessed the situation before walking through my garage door. Tom Beckford arrived with a flashlight and a claw hammer tucked through his belt loop as if he'd dressed for a construction site. Amara Singh came last, still in her EMT uniform, smelling of antiseptic and coffee. I'd pulled 2 folding tables together and placed Edwin's handwritten notes in the center. He'd given them to me that afternoon. 3 pages of meticulous observation logs with dates, addresses, and symptom descriptions. Dana was upstairs with Lily. I'd told her I was having a neighborhood meeting about the recent incidents. Technically true. Before I say anything, I began. I want each of you to tell me what you've noticed in the last 2 weeks. Not what you think is happening. What you've directly observed. Why you core. Ruth spoke first. Fran Delacroix called me on October 12th. She said Bertram was speaking in fragments and had stopped recognizing her. She asked me to come look at him, but by the time I got there the next morning, he was already in the ambulance. The paramedics wouldn't let me near him. One of them told me, off protocol, that they'd transported 11 people from this zip code in the previous 72 hours, all presenting identically. Tom went next. I was doing a deck repair for the Marshalls on Birch Street, 2 blocks over. Their neighbor came out of his house walking like his legs didn't bend at the knees, stiff, mechanical. He walked straight into the street without looking. A delivery truck had to swerve. The driver honked, and the man turned toward the sound so fast his neck popped audibly. I heard it from 40 feet. Amara's account was the most disturbing. 3 nights ago, my unit responded to a domestic disturbance on Ridgeland. When we arrived, a woman was locked in her bathroom. Her husband was on the other side of the door, ramming it with his shoulder, rhythmically, every 4 seconds, like a metronome. When the officers restrained him, he didn't resist with intelligence. He just kept lunging toward the nearest moving body. His temperature was 61 degrees. That's not compatible with life. That man should have been in a morgue. The garage went silent. I could hear the oak tree in the front yard creaking in the wind. Somewhere on the block, a porch light flickered. Gerald cleared his throat. So we're all seeing the same thing. I placed Edwin's notes forward and summarized his account. The hospital, the phases, the federal suppression. I expected resistance, the kind of rational pushback that people deploy when reality becomes architecturally unsound. Instead, I got 4 people staring at the table with the expression of passengers who've just felt the plane drop. Ruth recovered first. What's the infection vector? Edwin doesn't know. Possibly airborne. Possibly fluid contact. He said the hospital couldn't isolate it before they were ordered to stop testing. Ordered by whom? Tom asked. Federal Health Authority. He didn't get a specific agency. Amara leaned forward. If it's airborne, we've all been exposed already. The thought settled over the room like a cold sheet. I watched each of them process it. Ruth with clinical detachment, Tom with a tightening jaw, Gerald with rapid blinking. Amara with the absolute stillness of someone professionally trained to manage panic. Maybe, I said. But Edwin's been closer to it than any of us, and he's not symptomatic. Whatever the vector is, exposure isn't automatic, or it's selective, or there's a latency period we don't understand yet. That's a lot of unknowns, Ruth said, which is exactly why we need a plan built on what we do know. I laid it out. The supply cache in my basement, the plywood for reinforcing ground-level windows, the need for a communication system if phones went down. I proposed a rotating watch, 2-person teams, 4-hour shifts, monitoring the eastern approach where the infections seem to originate. You're talking about this like it's a siege, Tom said. I'm talking about this like it's Tuesday, I replied, and by Friday it might be. We divided responsibilities with the efficiency of people who understood that debate was a luxury with a closing window. Ruth took medical. She would inventory first aid supplies across participating households and establish a triage protocol in my basement. Tom took structural defense, boarding vulnerable entry points, reinforcing doors, identifying choke points around the block's perimeter. Amara agreed to maintain contact with her dispatch network for as long as emergency services remained operational, giving us an early warning system. Gerald, who had spent 20 years as a systems engineer, took logistics, water rationing, food rotation, power contingencies. My role was coordination and communication. I would be the link between our group and Edwin, who had agreed to keep monitoring the eastern neighborhoods and relay updates. We finished at 11:40 that night. As the others filed out of my garage into the dark, each returning to homes that suddenly felt less permanent, Amara paused at the threshold. Marcus? Yeah? That man on Ridgeland, the one with the 61-degree body temperature. When the officers grabbed him, he bit through one of their gloves, drew blood through the latex and the skin beneath. The officer was taken to Greystone Memorial. I called to check on him the next day. She paused. He'd been transferred to an undisclosed facility. No records. His partner told me he started sweating yellow within 6 hours. She walked into the night. I closed the garage door and stood in the oil-stained silence, feeling the weight of what we'd just set in motion. Upstairs, Dana was reading in bed. I sat on the edge of the mattress and told her, not all of it. I didn't mention Edwin's Phase 3 description or Amara's account of the officer. I gave her the broad shape. Something was spreading through the neighborhood. Several houses were already affected. And I'd organized a precautionary group with the neighbors. Dana listened with her reading glasses still on, the way she does when she's evaluating a student's excuse for late homework. You think this is real, she said. Not a question. I think Jake Maddox tried to bite a mail carrier yesterday and was removed by people in hazmat suits. I think Bertram Delacroix's body temperature dropped below the threshold of living tissue. I think the smell outside is getting stronger every night. She took off her glasses, set them on the nightstand, rubbed her eyes. How scared should I be? Enough to help me move the important things to the basement tomorrow. Not so scared you can't sleep tonight. It was a calibrated answer, designed to respect her intelligence without triggering the kind of fear that collapses function. She saw through it immediately. That's scared, she said quietly. Lily's room was down the hall. The nightlight threw a constellation of plastic stars across her ceiling. I stood in her doorway and watched her breathe. The small rise and fall of 5-year-old lungs that trusted the world absolutely. She'd arranged her stuffed animals in a semicircle around her pillow. A tribunal of plush guardians. Whatever was coming, she would not understand it. That was both a mercy and a wound. The next 3 days compressed into a single sustained exhale of preparation. Tom boarded the ground-level windows of 6 houses using the plywood I'd bought plus additional sheets he pulled from a job site. Ruth collected medical supplies into organized bins labeled with masking tape and permanent marker. Antibiotics, splints, sutures, tourniquets. Gerald mapped our block on graph paper, marking sight lines, blind spots, and the 3 points of vehicle access. I visited Edwin each morning. His reports grew darker with mechanical consistency. The Ridgeland neighborhood had gone largely silent. Emergency vehicles no longer responded to calls from the Eastern Corridor. He'd watched from the highway overpass as military vehicles. Not police, not National Guard, but unmarked flatbed trucks with canvas covers moved through the area at night without headlights. "They're not containing it," Edwin said on October 22nd. "They're cataloging it. There's a difference. How long before it reaches us fully?" He looked down Maple Avenue, at the oak trees and basketball hoops, and the quiet architecture of suburban belief in permanence. "I think it already has. You're just not seeing the ones who haven't turned yet." October 23rd delivered the proof we'd been dreading in a form none of us anticipated. It didn't come from the east. It came from within. Amara called me at 6:15 in the morning, her voice stripped of its professional composure. "Get to the Singh house, now. Don't bring Lily." I told Dana to lock the door behind me and jogged 3 houses down in my socks, still pulling on a jacket. Amara was standing on her front porch, arms crossed, face angled away from her own front door, as if she couldn't bear to look at it. "It's my mother," she said. Amara's mother, Devika, was 71 and had been living with Amara since her father's death 2 years prior. She was small, sharp-minded, and perpetually disappointed in the temperature of every room she entered. I'd spoken with her a handful of times. She made exceptional chai and never let you leave without a container of something she'd cooked. "She started sweating last night," Amara continued. "Yellow stains on her pillowcase. I checked her temperature at midnight. 94 degrees. I checked again at 4, 88. The numbers told the story. A living human body at 88 degrees is in severe hypothermia. A living human body doesn't sweat while hypothermic. "Is she conscious?" "She's sitting in the kitchen. She's looking at me, but she's not answering questions. She said my name once, about an hour ago. Since then, nothing. Her pupils aren't dilating properly." Ruth arrived 2 minutes later with her medical bag. Gerald stood watch at the front of the house. Tom waited at the back door with his hammer, not because anyone asked him to, but because he understood what Ruth was about to confirm. Ruth spent 12 minutes with Devika. When she came out, she closed the kitchen door behind her softly, the way you close a door when a child is sleeping. "She's presenting consistent with Edwin's phase 2. Motor degradation is advanced. Cognitive responses are intermittent at best. Her perspiration has that chemical compound. I can smell it from 3 feet away. Heart rate is 32 beats per minute." Amara absorbed this with her back against the hallway wall, sliding downward until she sat on the floor. She didn't cry. She pressed her palms flat against the hardwood, as if anchoring herself to something solid. "How long?" she asked. Based on Edwin's timeline, Phase 3 onset could be 12 to 48 hours from this stage. And Phase 3 means... It means she won't be your mother anymore, Amara. The silence that followed contained more violence than anything I'd witnessed up to that point. It was the silence of someone being asked to grieve a person who was still breathing in the next room. We had no protocol for this, all our planning. The plywood, the water jugs, the watch shifts had been built around an external threat. The possibility that the infection was already inside our perimeter, inside a home, inside a family, required a kind of decision-making that no one in that hallway was prepared for. "We have to isolate her," Gerald said from the front door. and the gentleness in his voice didn't soften the brutality of the statement. "She's my mother." Amara's tone was flat, declarative, as if stating a fact that should override all other considerations. "She is," Ruth said, kneeling beside her, "and she would not want to hurt you." They locked Devika in the master bedroom. Amara secured the door with a chair wedged beneath the handle and a bungee cord Gerald rigged to the hallway banister. Through the door, we could hear Devika moving, shuffling footsteps in a pattern that never varied, a slow circuit of the room's perimeter, bumping gently against each wall before turning. Amara slept on the hallway floor outside that door with a blanket and a kitchen knife she never intended to use. I know this because she told me later, during a conversation I'll recount when I'm able to form the words around it. That night, our group contracted its first wound. Not from contact, not from violence. From the recognition that the enemy was already among us, wearing the faces of people we loved. By October 25th, we had lost the pretense that normal life was continuing. School buses stopped running. Dana kept Lily home without explanation, though Lily, with the uncanny perceptiveness of children, knew something was wrong and stopped asking to go outside. The television stations cycled through increasingly hollow reassurances. A regional health advisory, a recommendation to limit non-essential travel. A scrolling banner that read, "Residents in affected zones should remain calm. Remain calm." As if calm were a place you could stay while the street you lived on was becoming a graveyard with functioning legs. Gerald's communication network picked up a ham radio signal from a man in the Ridgeland district, Dennis Kowalski, a retired electrician who had barricaded himself in his attic. His transmissions were fragmented and desperate. He reported that the streets below his house were occupied by what he estimated at 30 to 40 ambulatory infected, moving in loose clusters, responding to sound. He said they didn't run. They walked with a disjointed, mechanical persistence, their heads slightly tilted, mouths open. He said the military vehicles had stopped coming 3 days ago. "They've written us off," Dennis said through the static. "This whole sector. They've pulled back to a containment line somewhere west. You're on your own." Tom and I drove to the eastern edge of our block that afternoon and saw the barricade. Jersey barriers and concertina wire stretched across Birch Street where it intersected the highway on-ramp. Behind the barricade, at a distance of maybe 200 yards, a military checkpoint was visible, sandbag positions, a communications tent, 2 armored vehicles. Soldiers in full protective gear stood at intervals, facing inward, facing us. "They're not keeping something out," Tom said from the passenger seat. "They're keeping us in." I turned the truck around and drove home at exactly the speed limit, gripping the steering wheel with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. The containment line explained everything. The vanishing emergency services, the media blackout, the federal suppression Edwin had described. We weren't being helped. We were being managed, quarantined, left to resolve ourselves into whatever outcome the infection dictated. I called the group together that evening. Not in the garage this time, but in my living room, with the curtains drawn and every ground floor window boarded. Dana sat in the corner with Lily on her lap listening. She'd crossed over from skepticism into a state I can only describe as operational fear. Terror that had been compressed into function. "The military has sealed the eastern perimeter," I reported. "We're inside a containment zone. No one is coming to evacuate us." The reactions mapped onto personality with painful precision. Gerald went silent, calculating. Tom slammed his palm against the wall once, then steadied himself. Ruth closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds, then opened them with renewed focus. Amara, who had not left her mother's hallway in 2 days, listened through the phone Gerald held on speaker. How many infected have we confirmed on our block? Ruth asked. 3 addresses: Delacroix, Maddox, and Singh. That's confirmed. Unknown status on 5 other homes that have gone non-responsive. Non-responsive meaning? Meaning we've knocked, called, and received no answer in over 48 hours. Tom unfolded Gerald's hand-drawn map on the coffee table. He'd already marked the confirmed locations in red and the non-responsive homes in yellow. The pattern was clear. The infection was advancing from the eastern end of Maple Avenue toward the west, house by house, like a flame following a fuse. We establish a hard perimeter here, Tom said, drawing a line with his finger across the map at the midpoint of the block. My house, Gerald's house, the Castellano place, and yours. 4 structures in a line. We board everything east-facing, establish watch positions on the 2nd floors, and create a fallback route running west through the backyards. And everyone east of the line? Dana asked from the corner. Her voice was steady. Tom didn't answer. We can't save everyone, Ruth said. And she said it the way a surgeon says it, not with cruelty, but with the practiced detachment of someone who has triaged before. We save who we can reach. Lily looked up from Dana's lap. Save from what, Daddy? I didn't answer her. I'm not sure I've ever answered her. We built the perimeter in 9 hours. Tom directed the structural work with the quiet authority of a man who understood load-bearing walls and pressure points. We stripped fencing from 2 abandoned yards and erected a barricade across the street at the midpoint, using Gerald's car and Tom's truck as anchors with plywood sheeting bolted between them. It wouldn't stop a determined vehicle, but the infected weren't driving. Gerald wired a series of battery-powered motion sensors along the eastern approach, repurposed from home security kits scavenged from the non-responsive houses. Each sensor was linked to a wireless receiver in my living room that would emit a tone when triggered. Range was 40 feet. Not much, but enough warning to react. Ruth organized the medical station in my basement with a precision that revealed how much she'd been preparing mentally long before I'd invited her to the garage. She'd labeled zones: triage, treatment, isolation. The isolation area was sectioned off with painter's plastic sheeting and had its own ventilation path through the basement window. A crude, negative pressure concept she'd adapted from field hospital protocols. If someone gets infected inside the perimeter, we need containment ready, she explained. Not after, before. Amara joined us physically on the evening of October 25th. She arrived at my front door carrying a backpack and a sealed plastic bag. Her face held the geography of someone who had crossed a border they could never recross. She turned at 4 this afternoon, Amara said. She stopped walking the room and started hitting the door. Not knocking, hitting, rhythmically. I could hear her jaw working this clicking sound, like teeth snapping together over and over. Where is she now? Locked in the bedroom. I reinforced the door with screws through the frame. She paused. I said goodbye before she stopped being her. I think she heard me. Her hand moved toward my face. I think she was trying to touch my cheek. I took her backpack and led her inside. Dana had prepared the guest room without being asked, which was one of the moments I understood that my wife was not just enduring this crisis. She was building inside it. That first night with the perimeter active, I took the midnight watch with Tom. We sat on the 2nd floor of his house, which had the best sight line down the eastern stretch of Maple Avenue. The moon was half full. The sweet chemical smell was now so omnipresent it had become a baseline, like living next to the ocean and forgetting the salt. At 1:17 a.m., the first motion sensor triggered. The receiver in my living room chirped. Gerald radioed it to us immediately. Tom and I pressed against the window and looked east through binoculars he'd taken from his hunting supplies. 3 figures stood at the barricade. They didn't test it. They didn't push. They stood, swaying almost imperceptibly, faces angled upward as if scenting the air. In the moonlight, their skin had the pallor of something stored in water too long, bloated and grayish, with dark veining visible along the neck and forearms. Their mouths were open. One of them, I recognized the build, the posture, was wearing a Hargrove Postal Service uniform. "That's the mail carrier," Tom whispered. "The one Jake bit." We watched for 40 minutes. The 3 figures never advanced. They swayed, occasionally turning their heads in unison toward a sound. A raccoon in a trash can, a branch cracking, with that mechanical snap Amara had described. Then, as if responding to a signal we couldn't perceive, they turned and walked back east, not retreating, returning, as though they'd completed a patrol. "They're learning the edges," Tom said. "They're mapping us," I corrected. Neither interpretation was comforting. The infected weren't mindless. They weren't the shambling grotesques of old horror mythology. They were something worse. Persistent, pattern-driven, and adaptive. They tested boundaries. They responded to stimuli with coordinated behavior. Whatever cognitive architecture remained after Phase 3 wasn't consciousness, but it was strategy. I radioed the group at 2 a.m. They came, they looked, they left. Tomorrow we double the barricade. Nobody responded. Everybody heard. October 26th brought 2 developments that fractured our fragile stability in different directions. The first was a resource crisis. Gerald had completed his rationing calculations overnight and presented them during our morning briefing with the dispassionate delivery of a man reading stock returns. At current consumption, 6 adults, 1 child. Our combined food stores last 18 days. Water is more critical. The municipal supply is still running, but pressure has dropped 40% since yesterday. If it fails entirely, our stored water gives us 9 days. 12 if we cut to survival minimums. Survival minimums meaning what? Dana asked. Half a gallon per person per day, enough to prevent organ failure, not enough to feel human. The second development arrived at 10 a.m. in the form of a woman named Claudette Ware, who appeared at our barricade carrying a toddler and screaming for help. She'd come from the eastern end of the block, beyond our perimeter, from one of the non-responsive houses. Her son, Mateo, was 2 years old and silent in her arms with the wide-eyed paralysis of a child who has learned that crying draws the wrong kind of attention. Claudette was bleeding from a gash on her forearm, her shirt torn, 1 shoe missing. Tom and I reached the barricade with Ruth 30 seconds after Gerald's motion sensor alert. Claudette was pressed against the plywood, looking over her shoulder at the empty street behind her. "Please," she said. "They're in my house. They got my husband. He changed last night. Please, just let us through." The calculus was immediate and merciless. Ruth assessed the visible wound. A laceration on the outer forearm, consistent with broken glass, not consistent with a bite pattern. No yellow perspiration staining. Skin color normal. Pupils responsive. Temperature, checked with the forehead scanner Ruth carried in her jacket, read 98.4 degrees. "She's clean," Ruth said. We pulled her through a gap in the barricade and sealed it behind her. Claudette collapsed on the asphalt, clutching Mateo, sobbing with the full body convulsions of someone who has been holding terror in a sealed container that has finally burst. Dana took Mateo. Lily, watching from the living room window despite being told not to, pressed her hand against the glass when she saw the toddler. Later that day, she would give Mateo her stuffed rabbit without being asked. And something about that gesture, the instinctive generosity of a child in a world being stripped of generosity, made me step into the bathroom and grip the sink until my knuckles whitened. Claudette's account filled gaps in our understanding. Her husband, Derek, had shown no symptoms until 48 hours prior. No sweating, no disorientation. Then suddenly, a complete personality shift overnight. Confusion, aggression, loss of speech. By the following morning, he'd stopped responding to his name. By evening, he was standing in the corner of the living room, facing the wall, making a low tonal sound she described as like a hum, but wrong, like a hum played backward. She'd barricaded herself and Matteo in the nursery. Derek had found them by sound. She knocked a bottle off the shelf, and within seconds he was at the door, hitting it with the same rhythmic persistence we'd now heard described multiple times. She'd broken the nursery window with a lamp base, crawled out with Matteo strapped to her chest, and ran barefoot through backyards until she reached our line. "There are more of them," she said, after Ruth had cleaned and bandaged her arm. "In the houses. I could see them through windows as I ran. Standing. Just standing in rooms. Not moving. Waiting." The image she painted. Silent figures standing in dark living rooms behind curtained windows, motionless, patient, distributed across the neighborhood like dormant cells in a body waiting for a signal. Reframed everything. We'd been thinking of the infected as an approaching wave. Claudette's account suggested something more insidious. A network, already embedded, already surrounding us. Held in a state of suspension that could activate at any moment. Gerald updated his rationing calculations. 8 people now. 16 days of food. Less if the water failed. The perimeter held. But its meaning had changed. It was no longer a wall keeping danger out. It was a circle drawn around a shrinking island. And the tide was coming from below. On October 28th, the power went out. Not gradually. No flickering, no brownouts. One moment the lights were on, and the next, every electrical system on Maple Avenue died simultaneously, as if someone had pulled a plug from the earth itself. Gerald's motion sensors, which ran on batteries, continued functioning. Everything else, refrigerators, phone chargers, the radio link to Dennis Kowalski in Ridgeland, went dark. The silence that followed was unlike any quiet I'd experienced. Modern silence is never truly silent. It's underscored by the hum of appliances, the cycling of HVAC, the ambient electrical frequency that permeates every wall. Without it, the world sounded raw. I could hear the wind individually, each gust discrete, each branch articulated. I could hear my own heartbeat when I held still. And I could hear them. From the eastern end of the block, rising in the new silence like a choir warming up in an empty cathedral, the humming. Low, atonal, overlapping. Not unison. Each voice slightly offset, creating a dissonant wave pattern that seemed to press against the inner ear. Claudette had described it. Amara had heard it through her mother's bedroom door, for now it filled the night air with the unmistakable presence of dozens of sources. Tom counted the tones from his second-floor window. At least 20, maybe 30. They're in the houses, all the houses east of us. "They've been there," Ruth said through the walkie-talkie. "This whole time." Claudette was right. "Why are they humming now?" Gerald asked. Nobody had an answer. Edwin might have, but Edwin hadn't appeared at his corner in 2 days. I'd walked to the intersection that morning and found his sign face down on the sidewalk, its message blurred by rain. No blood, no signs of struggle, just absence. The humming continued for 3 hours and then stopped all at once, like a conductor dropping a baton. The silence that replaced it was worse. Dana and I lay in the dark of our bedroom with Lily between us, a flashlight standing upright on the nightstand like a candle. Lily was asleep. Dasana was not. "I need you to tell me the truth about something," she whispered. "Anything. Do you think we're going to die here?" I stared at the ceiling I couldn't see. The truth was a complex structure with load-bearing walls of its own. And I wasn't sure which ones I could remove without the whole thing collapsing. "I think we have a chance," I said. "A real one. But it depends on decisions we haven't had to make yet." "What kind of decisions?" "The kind that change who we are afterward." She reached across Lily's sleeping form and found my hand. Her grip was fierce. Not the gentle clasp of comfort, but the locked hold of someone securing themselves to a fixed point. "Whatever you have to do," she said, "you do it. And you bring her through this. Promise me." I promise both of you. Promise her first. The next morning, the water pressure dropped to a trickle. By noon, it stopped entirely. Gerald had anticipated this, and we'd filled every available container in advance. Bathtubs, pots, garbage cans lined with plastic bags. Our total reserve was approximately 160 gallons. At survival minimums for 8 people, Gerald calculated 20 days. If someone got injured and needed wound irrigation, less. If the weather warmed and dehydration accelerated, less. The resource ceiling was descending, and beneath it, the floor was rising. At 2 p.m., Tom called me to his workshop. He'd laid something on his workbench beneath a canvas tarp and pulled it back to reveal 4 weapons. 2 baseball bats with screws driven through the barrels, a crowbar, and a machete he'd sharpened on his bench grinder. I thought we agreed. "No gratuitous arms," I said. That was before the power went out, and 30 of them started humming in the dark. He picked up the crowbar and tested its weight. "I'm not a violent man, Marcus. I build things, but I'm done pretending we can solve this with plywood." I took the crowbar. It was heavier than I expected and colder, and holding it made something shift inside my chest. A tectonic adjustment between the man I had been and the man this street was forging me into. The first breach happened on October 30th at 3:47 a.m. I was on watch with Gerald in Tom's upper room when 4 motion sensors triggered in rapid sequence. Not from the eastern approach, or where we'd focused our defenses, but from the south, the backyard fences. Gerald jolted upright. "That's the Singh property, then Castellano. They're coming through the yards." I radioed Tom and Ruth simultaneously. "Southern breach, multiple contacts, backyards. Get to positions." What followed was the longest 11 minutes of my life. Each second individually weighted and unbearable. Tom reached the backyard first with a flashlight and the machete. His voice came through the radio in controlled fragments. 4. No. 6. Coming through Amara's yard. They breached the fence, chain link. They pushed through it. They don't feel the wire. Ruth's transmission overlapped. 2 more on my south side. They're at the basement window. They can hear the generator we ran yesterday. They're pressing against the glass. I ran downstairs and found Dana already awake, already moving, pulling Lily from bed with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had rehearsed this moment in her mind every night for a week. Claudette was in the hallway with Mateo strapped to her in a carrier, a kitchen knife in her hand, her face a mask of controlled fury. "Basement," I said. "Now, everyone." The women descended with the children. I grabbed the crowbar and went out the back door. The moonlight was bright enough to cast shadows. And what I saw in those shadows rearranged my understanding of threat. The infected moved through our backyards, with a fluid coordination that belied their deteriorated bodies. They didn't stumble over obstacles. They navigated them. They didn't cluster at bottlenecks. They spread laterally, covering ground with the instinctive spacing of predators who have learned to encircle. Their heads swept side to side in continuous scanning arcs, mouths open, that clicking jaw sound rattling across the night air like dozens of castanets. Tom engaged the first one at the gap in Amara's fence. I heard the impact, dense, final, and Tom's grunted exhalation. Through the radio, 1 down, 5 still moving. Gerald had positioned himself on the roof of his garage with a spotlight powered by a car battery. When he activated it, the beam cut across the yards, and the infected responded instantly. Every head snapped toward the light source with that mechanical precision. For 3 seconds, they were frozen, oriented on the beam. Then they advanced toward it. "Gerald, kill the light," I shouted into the radio. "They're coming to you." The light died. The infected paused, recalibrating. In that moment of confusion, Tom and I reached the southern fence line and began driving them back, not with lethal force, but with noise and motion. Banging the crowbar against fence posts, shouting, creating a wall of sensory stimulus that overwhelmed their targeting. It worked, partially. 4 of the 8 retreated south, moving in that disjointed mechanical walk back through the yards they'd breached. But 2 remained, standing at the edge of Gerald's property, swaying, heads tilted, listening, triangulating. Ruth's voice on the radio. "The 2 at my basement window are gone. They followed the others south." Amara, who had refused to go to the basement and was stationed at her own back door, transmitted next. "I can hear my mother. Through the bedroom wall. She's responding to the ones outside. Same hum, same frequency." The realization landed with the force of a structural collapse. The infected weren't just following sound. They were communicating. Devika, locked in Amara's bedroom, was functioning as a beacon, broadcasting her location, drawing others toward the block from inside our own perimeter. Tom reached the same conclusion simultaneously. "We have a transmitter inside the wire." The silence on the radio lasted 5 agonizing seconds. Amara's voice, when it came, was barely audible. "I know." 2 words. Entire civilizations of grief compressed into 2 words. We didn't resolve it that night. We reinforced the southern fences with everything we had. Additional plywood, wire, Tom's construction staples driven through 2x4s. We posted a southern watch. But everyone understood the underlying problem. The barricades, the watches, the weapons. All of it was compromised as long as a Phase 3 infected remained inside our perimeter, calling others home. I found Amara sitting on the floor outside her mother's bedroom at dawn on October 31st. The hallway smelled of that sweet chemical compound, concentrated and intimate, seeping through the door frame. Behind the reinforced door, Devika moved in her circuit. Step, shuffle, bump against the wall, turn, repeat. The humming had stopped at sunrise, as it always did, but Amara said it continued faintly through the night. A low vibration she could feel through the floorboards when she pressed her ear to the ground. "I need to talk to you about what happens next," I said, sitting down across from her. "I know what you're going to say. Then you know I don't want to say it." She looked at me with eyes that had aged a decade in 9 days. Amara Singh, 31 years old, EMT, the person most trained among us to save lives, now being asked to make a calculation about her own mother that no medical protocol had ever anticipated. "She's drawing them here," Amara said. "I understand the tactical reality, but I need you to understand something too. That woman in there held me when I had nightmares. She learned to drive at 64 so she could pick me up from night shifts. She burned every meal she ever cooked for me, and I ate all of them. And they were the best things I've ever tasted. I know. You're asking me to end that. I'm asking what you want to do, and I'll support whatever you decide. She turned her head toward the door. Behind it, the shuffling continued. Predictable, mechanical, and completely devoid of the woman who had burned beautiful meals and learned to drive at 64. If I open that door, she'll come for me. She won't hesitate. She won't recognize me. Everything she was is gone, and what's left is a navigation system that hunts by sound. Amara pressed her forehead against her knees. I became a paramedic because I wanted to preserve life. Do you understand what it costs to accept that preservation sometimes means something different? Ruth appeared at the end of the hallway. She'd been listening. She carried her medical bag and wore the expression she'd probably worn in the army when a field decision crossed from treatment into mercy. I can do it, Ruth said. You don't have to be the one. Yes, I do. Amara stood. She wiped her face with both hands. She took Ruth's medical bag and removed a syringe and a vial of concentrated potassium chloride, part of the emergency supplies Ruth had gathered, intended for cardiac intervention. In sufficient concentration, injected directly, it would stop a heart in seconds. I need you both to restrain her, Amara said. She'll respond to the door opening. She'll lunge. Hold her still. The three of us stood in that hallway with the morning light cutting through a window at the far end, turning dust motes into gold. And I understood that we were about to cross a threshold from which there was no return. Not a physical threshold, the door, but a moral one. The line between what we had been willing to do and what we were now required to do. Tom joined us without being called. He'd heard the conversation through the thin walls. He carried zip ties, the heavy-duty kind from his workshop, rated for 200 pounds of tensile strength. Amara drew the syringe. Her hands were steady. The hands of a woman who had started IVs in moving ambulances, who had performed CPR on highway asphalt. Steady not because she was unfeeling, but because professionalism was the only structure left that could contain her grief. Open the door, she said. Tom removed the bungee cord. Gerald, who had arrived silently, pulled the chair away. Ruth gripped the handle. I held the crowbar. The door opened. What stood inside the bedroom was wearing Devika's sari and Devika's face. But it was not Devika. It lunged with a speed that contradicted its deteriorated body. A burst of targeted motion, jaw snapping, arms extended, a sound emerging from its throat that was neither human nor animal, but something between. Something evolved for a single purpose. Tom and I caught her. We held her. Amara found the vein. It took 4 seconds. Then the humming stopped forever. November 1st. We buried Devika in the backyard of the Singh house, in the garden she had planted with marigolds in September, when the world still grew things for beauty. Ruth said words. Amara didn't. Lily placed a dandelion on the turned earth, and Mateo watched with the solemn incomprehension of a child too young to understand death, but old enough to sense its gravity. That afternoon the infected came again. This time from the east and south simultaneously, 23 by Tom's count from the upper window, moving in a coordinated pincer pattern that confirmed what we'd feared. They were adapting to our defenses. They no longer approached the barricade directly. They distributed along the perimeter, testing multiple points, drawing our attention laterally while a smaller group probed a gap in the western fence line we hadn't reinforced. Gerald's sensors gave us 90 seconds of warning. It wasn't enough. 3 breached the western gap before Tom could reach it. One of them entered Ruth's backyard and got within 10 feet of her basement window before Gerald intercepted with a bat. The impact drove the figure sideways, but didn't drop it. It recovered in 2 seconds, reoriented on Gerald, and lunged. Tom arrived from the flank and struck it at the base of the skull, with a force that ended the engagement permanently. The other 2 circled north, between houses, navigating obstacles with that fluid intelligence that made conventional barricades insufficient. Ruth tracked them from her upper window with the spotlight and directed Tom and me through the radio like a battlefield coordinator. First contact is at the Beckford driveway. Second is cutting through the Martinez yard. They're splitting. We split. Tom took the driveway. I took the Martinez yard. The infected I encountered was a woman I didn't recognize. Not from our block. Probably from the eastern neighborhoods. She wore a hospital gown, open at the back, and her feet were bare and blackened. Her skin had advanced beyond the gray stage into something mottled and translucent, with the dark veining now visible across her entire torso, like a road map of the disease's progression. She heard me before she saw me. Her head rotated toward my footsteps with that signature snap, and then she was moving, not running, but walking with an accelerated, purposeful stride that closed distance faster than seemed possible for her deteriorated frame. I swung the crowbar. The impact was something I carry in my hands. To this day, the vibration through the metal, the resistance, and then the give. The sound that I won't describe because some sounds deserve to remain in the moment they occurred. She fell. She did not get up. I stood over her in the Martinez backyard, beneath a sky turning amber with a sunset that didn't know or care what was happening on Maple Avenue. And I understood that I had become someone new. Not someone worse, necessarily, but someone irrevocable. The Marcus who had passed Edwin Poole every morning without listening, who had balanced a mortgage and debated school districts and measured his life in increments of suburban comfort. That Marcus was a draft of a person. This was the final version, edited by Catastrophe, published in Violence. When I returned to our perimeter, Dana was waiting at the back door. She looked at the crowbar in my hand and at whatever was on my face, and she didn't ask what had happened. She handed me a wet cloth and a glass of water and stood with me while I cleaned the metal in silence. That evening, Gerald presented an assessment none of us wanted to hear. The infected population in our immediate area is growing. They're migrating from the eastern sectors. Our perimeter is increasingly surrounded, and our resources are diminishing. At current trajectory, we face a convergence point in 3 to 5 days where we can no longer defend and can no longer sustain. Options, Ruth said. 1, we break west through the containment line, whatever's on the other side of that military checkpoint. They'll shoot us, Tom said. Maybe, but staying here is certain death on a longer timeline. I looked at the faces around the table. 5 adults, 2 children, each face illuminated by candlelight, each carrying the residue of decisions that would have been unthinkable 3 weeks ago. We go west, I said. 2 days to prepare. November 3rd, before dawn. The plan was Gerald's architecture, Tom's engineering, and Ruth's medical contingency layered into a single coordinated movement. We would leave at 4 a.m. on November 3rd, using the pre-dawn window when the infected were least active. A behavioral pattern we'd confirmed through 9 consecutive nights of observation. Their activity peaked between midnight and 3 a.m., then diminished to near stillness as dawn approached, as if their diminished biology required a recharge cycle. We'd move in a tight column through the western backyards, avoiding the streets where infected clustering was highest. Tom had pre-cut sections of the western fence lines, leaving them visually intact but requiring only a kick to breach. Our route covered 400 yards of residential backyards before reaching the open ground that preceded the military checkpoint. The checkpoint was the variable we couldn't control. Gerald had observed it through binoculars for 2 days, cataloging shift changes, vehicle movements, and patrol patterns. He'd identified a 3-minute gap between 4:15 and 4:18 a.m. when the southern observation post rotated and the replacement took time to adjust optics. 3 minutes to cross 80 yards of open ground with 2 children, Gerald said. If they're following protocol, they'll challenge before they fire. If they've been given shoot-on-sight orders, we won't make it. We won't make it here either, Amara said. Her first strategic contribution since Devika's death. Her voice carried the cold clarity of someone who had already endured the worst thing they could imagine and found the other side navigable. We spent November 2nd in focused preparation. Each adult packed a single bag: water, food for 3 days, medical essentials. Dana sewed a carrier harness for Mateo using curtain fabric and nylon straps, testing it twice with Claudette until the weight distribution allowed full arm mobility. Lily was given a small backpack with her water bottle, a granola bar, and the stuffed elephant she'd slept with since infancy. I told her we were going on an adventure in the dark, and that the most important rule was silence. Like a library? She asked. Quieter than a library. Like a library for fish? Despite everything. The barricades, the dead, the approaching convergence. I laughed. Donna did too. It was the last light moment before the crossing, and I hold it the way you hold a photograph of someone you're not sure you'll see again. That final evening, I walked the perimeter alone. The sun was setting behind the containment line, turning the concertina wire into a golden thread stretched across the horizon. The infected were stirring in the eastern houses. I could hear the humming beginning, building, layering. More voices than before. Many more. At the barricade, I found something that made me stop. Leaning against the plywood, placed deliberately where it would be found, was Edwin Poole's corduroy jacket, folded neatly. No note, no sign of him. Just the jacket, with its electrical tape patches, left like a message I could interpret a dozen ways. He'd been here, recently, and he'd chosen to leave the only possession I'd ever seen him carry. I picked it up and put it on. It fit poorly. Edwin was broader through the shoulders, but wearing it felt like shouldering a debt. He'd warned us. He'd stood on that corner and screamed the truth at a street full of people who were genetically incapable of believing that their carefully constructed normalcy could be dismantled by something they couldn't control. He'd been right about everything, and he'd disappeared without knowing if any of us had listened. At midnight, I stood watch for the last time. The humming rose from the east. Louder than any previous night, a wall of atonal resonance that seemed to vibrate the air itself. Tom joined me at the window. We didn't speak. We watched the moonlit street, our street, the place where we'd mowed lawns and argued about parking and waved without visiting. And we understood that by morning, it would belong to something else. Entirely. At 3:45 a.m., I woke the group. It's time. Lily held my hand. Dana held my other hand. The crowbar hung from my belt. We stepped into the dark. We made it. Not all of us, and not intact, but we made it. I won't describe the crossing in detail. That belongs to a different confession, one I'm not yet equipped to deliver. I'll say that the military didn't shoot. I'll say that a young soldier, barely 20, lowered his rifle when he saw Lily's face in the pre-dawn light and said, "Jesus Christ, there are kids." I'll say that Claudette's arm wound reopened during the sprint and that Ruth sealed it with field sutures on the other side of the wire, while Mateo slept against Dana's chest. I'll say that all 8 of us breathed free air on November 3rd. Edwin Poole was never found. His jacket hangs in my closet. I wear it on cold mornings when I walk Lily to her new school in a town 300 miles from Maple Avenue. Some nights I hear the humming. Dana says it's the furnace. She's right. She's always technically right. But I wake anyway, and I check the windows. And I stand in the dark, listening to a world that once ended on a Tuesday and might, at any moment, end again. I listen now. That's the difference. I listen. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe and stay tuned for the next one.